What makes a good assessment? Item writing approach. Welcome to the third of a series of video presentations which have been put together by Alpha Plus Consultancy with support from EEF and in partnership with the British Council and CBSE. These video presentations cover key aspects of a series of training courses which we have been delivering to teachers and CBSE staff to support end-of-class assessments that we have designed. These end-of-class assessments are for English reading, maths and science for classes 6 to 10. In this video, we will be looking at the approach to item writing. An item is the question asked in an assessment and its accompanying mark scheme and any metadata which is needed, such as the area of content and assessment objective covered. The item writing process that we suggest you adopt in this video is somewhat counterintuitive, as it doesn't start with the writing of the question, but instead the question is almost the last step in the process. However, what this ensures is that the item that is developed will better match the requirement of the assessment specification than if the question had been written first. There are 5 steps in the process. Steps 1 to 3 identify the idea for a question and what content and skills you want to assess. Step 4 identifies the approach to marking to be used. Step 5 is where the mark scheme and question are written. We begin by thinking about some tasks that would elicit evidence we would need to see to assess students fairly. What do we want the students to show that they know or can do? What aspect of the content do we want to assess, and what skill level as defined by the assessment objective? Thinking about the idea for a task is the creative bit of the item writing process. Ideas for tasks come from a lot of places: simple calculation or fact to be described, data you have seen that could be analysed, a text you like, a science diagram, an interesting maths problem to solve, a photograph you have seen, etc., etc. Real-world examples you come across that can be adapted into a question. Whilst it might be tempting to use a textbook as a source of inspiration for a task, there are many problems with doing this in terms of plagiarism and fairness to different students who may or may not have seen the textbook. For English reading assessments, the start is often a good source text that is the right level for the student to read, engaging and interesting with appropriate context and vocabulary. Not too hard or easy, not too long, not controversial. Once you have a text, then the tasks can be considered for what you could ask the student to do with the text. Where there are set texts, the inspiration for the task will come from an aspect of the text, and this may involve identifying a portion of the text to be reproduced in the assessment for the students to use to answer any questions. For the poetry, it is likely to be the whole poem. The level of evidence relates to the assessment objectives that you want to assess and the type of task you want the students to be able to do. Is the task open-ended, or is it constrained with a simple short answer, or should it be very constrained with an objective question? The type of task and the assessment objective are often intrinsically linked, as it is easier to assess some assessment objectives with particular task types than others. Write the purpose. What is it you are trying to test? What does the student need to show that they know or can do? This needs to be written down. When deciding on the task, you need to make sure that the content being assessed is taken from the learning ladder and clearly relates to the assessment objective you are using. The purpose should reflect this in the way it is written. The purpose you write down should be referred back to in the item writing process to make sure that you do not lose sight of what the question will try and assess. Here is a simple example of the steps in the process. Idea for the task. Watching the Olympic cycling gave me the idea to test students' understanding of velocity in the context of a cycle race. I realized this may be too complex, so thought about a cycle journey instead. Level of evidence. Looking at section 9.6.8, draw and interpret distance time and velocity time graphs of the learning ladder, I can see that this would lend itself to an analysis question, which is Assessment Objective 3 if I gave the student a graph to interpret. It may be a calculation-based question. Purpose. The purpose of the item is to assess whether students can understand and interpret a velocity time graph. How you mark the assessment is a key consideration of the process. The level of constraint and the type of response you expect students to provide will govern the type of mark scheme which you should use. For English and Science, unconstrained items, those with free response that are extended and expect more than recall of knowledge, will need a level or response mark scheme. This is used to judge the quality of an answer against a level description rather than a point-based mark scheme which is used to match student responses to the correct answer. Semi-constrained items may be marked using a level of response mark scheme or a point-based mark scheme, depending on the nature of the task. If an explanation is expected in the answer or the student is expected to make a judgment about a situation, then a level-based mark scheme would be best. If a semi-constrained task expects a descriptive response or one which lists or states information, then the marker can just match the response to the mark scheme, and a point-based mark scheme would work. All constrained tasks will use point-based mark schemes as the response will be a single word or the correct choice on a multiple-choice question, and the marker will just match the answer to the mark scheme. In maths, level of response mark schemes are not used, but mark schemes for more complex questions that require multiple steps need to allow errors in early steps to be carried forward so students are not penalized multiple times for an early mistake in their calculations. Going back to our example item, we are looking to see whether the students can interpret a velocity time graph. Type of mark scheme. The task will be constrained as it will ask students to interpret the graph, so the mark scheme will be point-based. The choice of mark schemes can be summarized in this table, which relates the level of evidence expected to the type of task and hence the question type and response expected. This then governs the type of mark scheme that should be used. For unconstrained and very constrained items, there is no real choice about the mark scheme, but for those tasks which are semi-constrained, then there is a choice to be made, and this depends very much on the level of evidence expected. We will explore the different types of mark schemes in the videos on short answer questions and extended response questions. We are now at point 5 on the item writing process, where we can start to draft the item. You probably have a rough idea for the type of question you want to use. This would be the instruction to the students that tell them what they need to do, and you will have an idea of the sources or other materials that they will need to use to answer the question. It is at this point you would start to write the draft question and mark scheme. Using this draft, you will need to make sure that the mark scheme will match the item purpose. That is, it will reward students for what they are required to show. You will need to make sure that the question clearly sets out the task you want the student to do and that the mark scheme will reward what the question asks for. You will need to make sure that the command word chosen is appropriate, that it makes clear to the students what they need to do and requires them to provide the evidence you want to assess. There is no point in having an item which is looking to test a student's ability to explain why a phenomena occurs if the question asks them to just describe the phenomena. This will lead to an invalid assessment item. Once you have the first draft of the question and mark scheme, you need to review them against the item purpose and each other to make sure that the question will be clear to students so they know what they need to do. The students will be able to try and do the task that they are being asked to do and present suitable evidence of this. The mark scheme will reward better attempts at the task, so that better attempts will get higher marks, and that the item will meet the purpose you described in step 3. This will be an iterative process where you will make changes to the question and the mark scheme to ensure that they are aligned and meet the purpose. It is exceptionally unusual for someone to write an item from scratch and get it right the first time. We will look at command words in the video on short answer questions. Here is the item which was created as the end product of the process. The source, question, and mark scheme went through a series of iterations, starting with a source with multiple cyclists and a question which asked the student to calculate which cyclist had maximum deceleration. However, this was too complex and didn't really assess whether a student really understood how the shape of the graph related to the acceleration and deceleration rates of the cyclists. In the end, the velocity time graph is relatively simple as it just has two cyclists, so is uncluttered, clear, and easy to interpret. The question is constrained, so a point-based mark scheme is appropriate and it is clear how the mark is awarded. It is also clear to the student what they need to do. Identify from the graph which cyclist decelerates most rapidly, which means that they have to know which portion of the lines relates to deceleration and that the angle of the line indicates the rate of deceleration. Having clear mark schemes are vital for ensuring that assessments perform as expected. By writing the mark scheme and the question together, it helps ensure that they match each other. If the mark scheme doesn't match the question, then there is a risk that good answers will not be rewarded appropriately and that poor answers will be marked as correct. It will impact on reliability and validity of the assessment. There are a number of different approaches to a mark scheme which can be used, and some are better than others. Bad mark schemes give no guidance to the marker. They may just show a model response. This does not tell the marker how to award the marks or what each of the marks should be awarded for. This may be acceptable for a simple multiple choice type item where there is only one correct answer for one mark, but it would not be for other types of questions. Poor mark schemes just contain a list of good responses. These might give an indication to the markers about what marks can be awarded for, but they do not really define the boundaries of acceptable answers, so it is hard for markers to judge borderline responses. Good mark schemes list good and poor answers and attempt to specify what is and isn't acceptable for the marks. They try to define the outcome space which shows the right and wrong answers that the students are likely to give. However, the item writer may not anticipate all the good and bad answers, so the list may not be complete and there may be some ambiguity. Excellent mark schemes define the rules or principles by which marks are awarded, which helps to define the boundaries between good and poor responses and allows markers to decide how to reward each answer on its merits. One specific type of mark scheme which is rule-based is a level of response mark scheme, which describes the performance of a response using a description of the features it contains. We will look at these more in the extended response questions video. One important aspect of writing items is managing the demand of the items. The demand is an estimation of how difficult the question will be to answer. It is important that the demand of the question is appropriate for the student sitting the assessment. This includes any sources such as reading texts for English as well as the tasks themselves. Assessments need to be able to cater for all the different abilities of students who take the assessment. Sometimes individual questions can cater for a full range of abilities. For example, an English essay question, but in many cases there should be questions of different demand. Some should be accessible to low-ability students so they can show what they know and can do, and other questions must stretch the most able students. How demand is varied is important, and there are both legitimate and illegitimate ways in which demand can be changed. There are two types of sources of demand: those which are legitimate, that is to say, they can be used to set harder or easier tasks for students, and those which are illegitimate, which should not be used to set harder or easier items. Legitimate sources of demand include asking a question about a difficult concept or area of content. For example, some aspects of mathematics are harder to understand than others. Alternatively, a harder task can be devised for the same content area. The demand of the task could be changed on the basis of assessing a higher order skill such as evaluation rather than just straight recall of knowledge, requiring an unconstrained open-ended response such as an essay rather than a constrained response, such as completing a table of information with headings, as this means that the student has to also organize their own thoughts, which is more demanding. Having multi-step processes which are harder for students to manage. This is widely used in maths where calculations can be multi-step or single-step for the same content area, using abstract tasks rather than concrete tasks. For example, an abstract task asking students to explain Darwin's theory of evolution is more demanding than a concrete task which asks the student to explain Darwin's theory of evolution based on diagrams of a series of Galapagos finches linked to the environment in which they live. Illegitimate sources of demand generally relate not to the task, but to the question or mark scheme. These include questions which are unclear or complex and obscure the task that the student is being asked to do. Mark schemes which do not match the questions and do not reward students for correct answers. A level of language or reading skill required to understand the question that is higher than the reading ability of the student. Irrelevant sources and diagrams that confuse or distract the student and make them think that they are needed to answer the question when they are not. It is important that when writing a question that the demand is considered and is appropriate for the target students. Demand should be managed but not through illegitimate means. Writing good assessment items is an art and not a science, and the more you do it, the better you get. But the approach set out here will help ensure that when you write items, you maximize your chances in them being the good ones.